Right. Welcome back to the extended project qualification presentations. This one is all about getting started with research. So this is helpful not only if you haven't started your research yet, but if you've also just started and you're getting a bit lost with it, this might be helpful for you to look through as well. So in the setting a question, I talked about how it's an iterative process. Sort of setting the question and research. The same goes for planning or research. Like, what comes first? Do you plan your essay or your artifact, or do you research it? And that's a big question. I ask my students this all the time when they're in their first year and looking at criminal law. So it's difficult to start researching if you don't know exactly what you need to research, but then also you don't know what you don't know. So you've got that sort of, do you start the research first and then you'll have an idea of planning? My biggest word of warning here would be that if anyone is anything like me, I am a little bit scared of that, like actually starting writing, and the planning feels quite close to starting writing. So I will keep reading and I'll be like, oh, I'll read a bit more. Maybe I'll read a bit more. Oh, it's a bit scary to start, so I'll read a bit more now. So if that sounds like you, one of the best things you can do is start to sketch out a plan to keep you focused, to try and stop you hiding in the reading, so to speak. That's not to say reading's not good. See, I love reading, gonna always endorse reading, but there it is an element that you have to get through the rest of the project too. So it's impossible to read everything on a topic. If it is possible to read everything on your topic, then go back to the video on setting a question and think, is that question too small? Like, have I got enough resources to be able to do this question? Where do you start, Becca? Do you start with planning? Do you start with research?
I have a plan in mind. So if I've got my topic, I will start to think about who the key authors are, if I know who they are, or I may have kind of thought about what the different research terms are that I might need. So, for example, if we use the question in the setting a question video around COVID-19 and care homes, we already have key kind of terms that we need to think about, and then I will then read, but then I will plan and then read again and again. Once I feel satisfied, I suppose, that I have an idea, then I will start to write as well. So yeah, I think I also tend to hide in the reading, but I'm kind of, there's a point when I have to be honest with myself and go, okay, I just need to sketch out some ideas. They can be really drafty, but that's kind of part of the planning and drafting process.
Yeah, and it is the planning and drafting process that lets you see where your gaps are as well. So when you're reading and just reading, it's quite difficult to see where you have loads of sources and where you might have too few. So we've got a few hints and tips as we go through this to sort of show where you might be able to highlight any gaps that you've got. But also, don't be scared to go back and research, as Becca just said, when you start writing. So it might be that you're writing something and one part seems really full and supported by loads of evidence and you can talk at length, and then one part just seems a bit more sparse. You can just go back and read on that element. So research, even though we've set up these videos and lots of the ways that the EPQ is set out looks like this linear process that you set your question, you do your research, you write, actually it does all merge in together a little bit. Okay, so thinking about research, what is it that you actually need to do? So we've taken this from the AQA specification, but we acknowledge that there are lots of different examples you could be doing your EPQ with. So it's worthwhile checking your own specification. And if you don't know what your specification is, have a chat to your supervisor or the teacher in charge of the EPQ. But AQA say that they want you to obtain, critically select and use information from a range of sources. Okay, so firstly, we're thinking about that big range of sources, not one or two, like as wide a range as possible. You want to analyse data, apply it relevantly and demonstrate understanding of any appropriate linkages, connections and complexities of the topic. So going back to that question that we set before in the setting the question of, did the UK government's response to COVID-19 adequately protect care home residents? You've got lots of things. You've got to think about the range of sources that you're going to use. So are you going to use things like journal articles? Are you going to use media reports? Are you going to use government data? Are you going to question that government data? This is a really great topic to be able to analyse data. So you're not only looking at what the data says, think about how you can criticise it. Like, is it valid? Are there any flaws in the way that it's been collected? So then you need to have a think about, are you doing primary or secondary research? Are you doing a bit of a mix of both for your project? Okay, so when we talk about primary research, we're really talking about you completing studies to be able to answer a question or to be able to give a bit more insight into something. So it's data that doesn't exist before you've acted. Okay, so there's lots of different types of primary research. We're not going to talk through these individually, but I'm going to hand over to Becca for thinking about like how you might complete some of these and the things that you need to consider.
So, for example, we start with the experiments. This is something, as Trello identifies, is hard to do in the social sciences, except psychology. So I wouldn't necessarily expect anyone to be doing an experiment as part of their EPQ. You may have a hypothesis that you wish to test. So that may be working with participants and thinking about answering a particular question. But you need to be thinking then about your ethics of working with participants. So making sure that no participants come to any harm during the study. That may be physical harm, but it can also be psychological and well-being harm as well. You also need to think about what the participants can gain from taking part in your study. So, for example, the participants are going to give up their time. They're going to be giving you some information about themselves. Particularly, this also applies to surveys and case studies and evaluations in the action research, because you may be asking participants questions. They could be in the form of a questionnaire, or you could be interviewing participants, so for a case study or an evaluation, and you need to be able to give them something back as well. So it doesn't have to be anything huge, but it's just about how you would be able to contribute to a wider field of knowledge about your topic area, so that we can advance the concepts, the ideas within society as well. But it is really important that you think through the ethics and also making sure participants don't come to any harm.
Sure. So when thinking about the ethics, there is an activity you could do if you know a few other people that are doing an EPQ, or if you're watching this as a class, or if you're a teacher watching this, one of the activities that's suggested is to form an ethics panel. So those questions that Becca's just said about, like, how are you going to ensure that participants don't come to any harm? What's the benefit to them? It's worthwhile also adding in some questions like, what if a participant wants to withdraw from the study? Sort of how are they going to be able to do that? And really crucially, is this voluntary? Like, are you ensuring this is purely voluntary? If I'm going to survey my students, am I placing them under unnecessary pressure here? Am I expecting them to participate? I absolutely cannot link it to their grade. It can't be a forced participation in this way. But also thinking about just good design as well. Like, am I going to get honest answers? And lots of things to consider there. But an ethics panel is a great activity to do, to encourage you to ask other people those questions about their research. And then while you're doing that, it also sort of gets you into the practice of thinking of those questions about your own research as well. If you are going to do some primary research, think about how you're going to structure it as well. So there's loads of different research models you can follow. There's one called PICO, P-I-C-O, if you're looking particularly in sort of like the social sciences. But it's worth having a look. Talk to your supervisor about research that you want to complete and any sort of research modules that might work for you. If we're looking at secondary research, which everyone should be doing as part of their literature review, and even if you're making an artifact, you're still going to be looking at, well, how have other people done this in the past? Why am I going down this route? Then one of the great ways you can assess how good that source is, because we all use the internet every day. You can find loads of information on pretty much any topic you want. But how do you distinguish what's good information and good enough for you to include in your study, and what information actually isn't that reliable? So Harris has this great method, and we use it all the time definitely in my subject, where we're sort of thinking about the different journal articles that we're using. But it's this CARS model. So it's consider the credibility of the source. So who is the author? Why have they got something valid to say in this topic? Okay, so always look up the author. If a piece doesn't have an author, why not? Why is the author not listed? Why do they not want their name attached to this? But firstly, thinking about credibility, do they have any sort of qualification or sort of gravitas, I suppose, in this area? Okay, think about the accuracy. So if the source uses data, where has that data come from? Thinking about if it's somewhere that's gathered data in the first instance, like what's the methodology? How has that data been gathered? And that goes all the way back to that specification, again, that you're looking at being able to analyse data. Think about the reasonableness of topic, like what's the purpose of it being written? There are so many agendas that will hide behind that people have for writing. So it kind of links to that credibility. Look up the author, like are they coming from a particular angle? If they are, it doesn't mean you can't use them or you shouldn't use them, but it's just being aware of it. If you're reading with a critical mind, it is reading, asking all of these questions as you're going along. And then think, like, is there support for that sort of that position, or particularly if they're using data, like is this supported anywhere else, or is this an outlier and standalone? Again, this doesn't mean you shouldn't use something, but it's just thinking about, okay, where's it from? Going back to accuracy, quickly, one bit that I forgot to mention, what's the date? Okay, so when was this information published? Has anything changed since then? So linking back to that question of, did the UK government's response to COVID-19 adequately protect care home residents? What date, if you're looking at data, or if you're looking at guidance, if you're looking at criticism even, when was it written? Like, how has the situation moved on since then? Is something reasonable? Who's written it? And you'll learn that through different levels of study. So in law, we have kind of this hierarchy of journal articles. If it's in something like the Modern Law Review, then that means that it's had to go through quite a rigorous process to get into that publication in the first place. It's been peer reviewed by people at the top of their field. So it's not only one author's submission, it's then been reviewed by two other experts, at least in that field, often more. It just looks sort of like, so not only looking up who the author is, but also where is this found? Okay, so if you're doing web-based research, think about who's the sponsor of the website. Is the author affiliated with a reputable institution or organisation? Okay. Does the information reflect the views of that organisation, or is it only the views of the author? Okay, and like having a look at where is this printed? So if I was going to publish something and it was going to be linked from the UEA website, it should say very clearly whether or not I'm representing the views of UEA, whether it's just me, sort of where it's been published, and things like that. If you can't tell, if it's not very clear who the sponsoring institution is, and we see this a lot with like blog posts and with various things, then have a look at the URL, which is like the long website address at the top. Like look at the last three letters there, because it might give you a bit of a clue. Okay, so there is .edu is used by lots of educational institutions. .gov indicates governmental sites. .org is trickier and require a bit more research because they're sponsored by non-profit organisations. So some of which might be reliable and some might be incredibly biased. So that requires a bit more. Once you find out like who that website is, then you need to look into that. .com, again, you're looking at caution because they often have corporate or commercial sponsors. So you're looking not only at the sort of agenda of the author, but also like, why is it on that website? And .name indicates a personal site. Now, all of these things have been taken from the Writing Advice Centre, the University of Toronto. They have a great resource, so it's worthwhile. I've included the link down here. Have a look at the slides that we've uploaded. Maybe have a look through there. They've got great information about sort of researching online, because it can be a bit of a minefield. One thing we've not talked about in this is researching using newspaper articles. Now, they can be, depends on what you're using them for, because it can be a great way to demonstrate how media represents something, or like possibly the mood of a particular sector of society, and who they're writing for. But it's rare that you would use them to offer data. Like, they're often there as a sort of headline, but then you want to look at where the data came from. So there's lots in research where you're sort of like going back, you're tracking back through. It's worthwhile looking at who's written the article. So it might be like, great, the person that's written the article is a scientist. Actually, who are they? Look them up then. See if you can find the original paper. If there's data that's included, there should be a link, or at least an acknowledgement of where that data has come from. If there's no acknowledgement of where that data has come from, and it's just in a random news article, treat it with extreme caution, because where have they got that from? Like, it is unlikely that the journalist is moonlighting for the Office of National Statistics. Okay. Is there anything you wanted to add on this, Becca?
Just again, to be aware of the source of the media outlet as well, because they will have their own perspectives, perhaps their own biases as well, and why they're writing the pieces that they're doing. So exactly as you said, Kristina, if they do mention a study, go to that original study to have a look at that, and then also try and do some research around that study as well. Is that something, the findings of that other people have also agreed with, or is it different? Just to try and increase the credibility of what you're looking at.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so then some of the other important things to do is to keep track of what you're reading. Okay, so making sure that you have all the citation information. So we're going to do a video on referencing. So have a look at that, ideally before you start researching, so that you can sort of get an idea of what information you need to note down as you're researching. File your hyperlinks. So it's worthwhile having a document where you file your hyperlinks and make it easier to return to, and note down the date that you visited the website. Okay, that's important, firstly, so that you can review if information changes, but also as part of that referencing exercise. If you're using web-based resources, you note down when you visited it. And finally, like, thinking about taking critical notes. We said right at the start of this, we'd give you some hints and tips about sort of how to take notes, how to sort of see where you've got gaps. One way to do it is to have this list, like this objective, have your objective at the top, so which objective it is you're trying to, or this research relates to, and then having all of that information, so your source information, so like your citation information there, an overview of that evidence or the argument that's being forwarded, but then thinking not only just that, because that's where you're just providing other people's arguments and you're not thinking critically. So then think, how does this link specifically to my project? Does it raise additional questions? And if it does raise additional questions, that's where this planning might lead you to more research. So this, I want to read a bit more around this particular area. And then finally, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree with the position? If you want to get really analytical here, add in another, does this agree, sort of in these two, does it raise additional questions? So what do I think? Do I agree, disagree? Give your reasons here if you agree, disagree. Does it link to something else that another source that you've read disagrees with as well? Great, so that's the end of the getting started with your research, but we've added some extra resources to the resource bank, so have a look at anything if you want some more information around sort of like either this taking notes or using the internet for that. And definitely before you start research, make sure you check out the referencing slide.